All right, we're ready to start watercolor. And there's just a few things that you need to know about watercolor. So watercolor paper is different than any other type of paper. It is measured in pounds. So if you look here at this tablet that I'm pulling this out of, you'll notice it says 140 pounds. So that is the thickness of the paper. So the higher the pound is, the better quality paper. So if you had 90-pound paper as opposed to this 140, it'd be a little bit thinner. So as far as water paper goes, you're looking for the higher pound paper for better quality. So that's something that you need to know about watercolor paper. And then there are different types of watercolors. So for example, there are the pan type of watercolor that you're probably most familiar with. These are, you use those back in elementary school. They're a little bit cheaper quality as far as um, they're probably $2 for this double set pan here. Uh, they're easy to transport. Um, they're just a little bit lower quality than what we're going to use for class here. So we're going to use watercolors like this that come in a tube. So they're liquid and you squeeze out the tube onto your tray. And I already did that for you, but you can see there's a variety of different colors and these last forever. That's like a huge bonus to this type of watercolor. I've had a set like this and I've had them for quite some time and I've hardly made a dent in them because they last forever. So that's really nice. And even when these watercolors, like if you put it on your tray and it dries out, all you have to do is rejuvenate it with water. So that's really nice. There's a third type of watercolor that's a liquid form that is quite a bit more expensive. But that's another type of watercolor that comes that you should be aware of. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take our tape, and just like we did with acrylic painting, we're going to take that tape and go a little bit onto your pants or your shirt, and I'm going to tape around the outside edge here of my piece. So you're going to do that all the way around. And then we're going to divide this paper into 4 squares or quadrants because we're going to do some application of watercolor. So there's kind of different ways to apply watercolors, and we'll go over that, and we'll go over the different types of brushes there are as well. And you want to have yourself set up with, typically I always say get a paper towel always with you at all times, because with watercolor, if you make a mistake and blot it up with paper towel right away, you can sometimes salvage it. So I always say have some paper towel with you, and then your water. Okay, so I gave you a water cup, so I've got some water here off to the side. I've got my tray here, and there's different types of brushes, so I'm going to go over that quick with you. So there are round brushes and there are flat brushes for watercolor. Okay, these sometimes are called round or oval mop brushes. And the nice thing about they see the rounded on the edges there is they soak up water. Like they're meant to, like especially this bigger one, soak up water when you're using it. The brush size is always listed the number, so you can see it's 10 there. That's the size of the brush. So the smaller brush here, you'll notice that one's a 3. So brush sizes are numbered by size. And then there's also flat brushes. So if you look at the flat brushes for watercolor, okay, they have a flat edge there. They're also numbered by size. So this is a number 4. This one's a number 8. And then this one's a 1/2 inch wide. So it's a 1/2 an inch wide here. So you'll find out which ones you like the best. These are really good for what we're going to do today, either this flat one here or this round one for what we're going to do today. So you have your tray, and I've already kind of set up your tray for you, and you've got all these different colors going all the way around. I like to think of the magenta here, that like hot pink color is color number one, and then it kind of goes around in rainbow order. So you've got some reds, red, orange, orange. You'll see all the way around in your tray. So the first application of watercolor that I want to do is I'm going to take my round big brush here, that 10 brush, and I'm going to, and this one's called Wet on Wet. So I'm going to take that round mop brush and I'm wetting that first square, that first quadrant. And wet on wet, all right, the first wet is for wet for the paper. And then the second wet is for how your paint's going to be. So I'm really soaking up this paper. And this is good for sky type, I think, because you kind of get a puddling effect with this one. You don't have as much control though, so I want you to be aware of that. So I've got my paper really wet. Here you'll notice I've taken water, really soaked it into the brush, and then wet my paper. So I'm going to take and really wet that teal color, and you'll notice how it like pools as I pull it, and it kind of puddles with this wet and wet technique. Okay, so you can see the paper is really wet. It kind of creates some kind of puddling a little bit with it. So that's the first watercolor application. The next one is wet on dry. So my paper, again, I'm going to wet my paper, because remember that first part is how the paper is treated. So I'm going to wet the paper. And then I said it's wet on dry. So now I'm going to switch to a little bit smaller brush here. And I'm going to just slightly, because you have to have your paint be a little bit wet, but slightly wet my paint, but hardly at all. So here you can kind of see I'm just hardly. And then I'm going to come back through. So you'll see it gives it a different effect. You'll find which technique you think you have more control of. I'll give you my opinion for my personal taste, but you're going to have to find out what works best for you. So these different applications of watercolor are good to kind of experiment and see what happens as you apply the watercolor. Okay, so that one, I felt like I had a little bit more control over it than this one. It was just puddling and pooling all over the place. But that one might be really good, like I said, for a sky, that wet on wet. So then the next one is dry on wet. So my paper stays dry, because the first part is how our paper is treated. And then my watercolor is wet. So I'm going to really wet my watercolor here. And I think we'll use this kind of orangish color, yellow orange. So I'm really getting that nice and wet. And then okay, that one I felt like I had a little bit more control. Personally, this is the one I like the best. I feel like I have more control over things, but like I said, you're going to find out which one you are more comfortable with. But this one, I feel like it doesn't pool all over the place. It feel, for me, like I have just better control over the media. Okay, so that one is dry on wet. So the paper stays dry, your paint is wet. And then the last one, I'm going to move my camera just a little bit, for this last square is a dry brush technique. And this one is really good to use in detail areas. So I'm using that round number 3 small tinier brush, and I'm going to just slightly wet my paint. So very slightly. And I'm kind of going like this on my tray so that it's not soupy or like it's not dripping off. And then I'm going to, just right now, I'm going to paint kind of a tree trunk here. And I'm going to have my branches kind of coming off. So every once in a while dipping it back into the paint. But this one, dry brush is really good for detail area because you have a lot of control, in my opinion, over your paint. Okay. Okay, and I can go back in and even add texture to this. Then I'm going to switch brushes. Okay, and just give some texture into the, and actually switch brown colors first. So I'm going to use a darker brown, dry brush technique, come in, just add some of this different shades of brown in here. Just helps to add some dimension too. There's 3 different browns on your palette. You can mix up more browns by mixing colors in the middle of your tray as well. All right, then I'm going to switch and use a different brush here. I'm going to use one of these flat brushes here. And I'm going to take some green and can come in. Just add some leaves in there. Layer it. I'm going to mix up some yellow green next and kind of layer that in just to give it some more dimension with that dry brush. See, that yellow starts to give it some dimension as you layer in, kind of creating a yellow greenish color. Okay, so go ahead and draw me a little picture for your dry brush. It does not have to be a tree. I just, quickly did that to show you the dry brush technique. So remember, it's wet paper, wet paint in the first one, then wet on dry. So you wet your paper, fairly dry paint, then dry paper with wet paint, and then that dry brush technique where it's hardly using any water, like so you have a little bit more control over the media. So those are your